Thanks, Chris. Now let's turn to today's talk and John. So we're thrilled to have John join us. John, he's the manager of historic programming and the head of interpretation at Fort Meigs Historic Site in Northwest Ohio. He's an educator, composer, musician, and sailor. His current area of focus is the U.S. Army's use of music throughout its entire history. As such, Mr. Thompson leads Fort Meigs Fife and Drum Corps and heads their Army Field Music presentation. He's a recent recipient 2021 of the Ohio Academy of History's highest award for his work on the War of 1812 podcast, The Foot of the Rapids. So, John, I'm going to turn it over to you. Take us away.
All right. Thank you very much, Tom. And thank you all for joining me and us today to talk a little bit about the War of 1812 here in Northwest Ohio. And I know this might be a subject that some of you are familiar with, but hopefully I can shed some fresh light on the subject and bring a somewhat American perspective, I guess, to the story and talk a little bit about the weather. As you can see, the mud being prominently featured in our title today. Because the weather will have a tremendous impact on the year 1813 and the war out here in the Western theater. I just wanted to start talking a little bit about where I am right now. I am sitting in the visitor center at Fort Meigs, and Fort Meigs is a reconstruction of the original 1813 site. And many people ask, in terms of the reconstruction, how close is it to what the soldiers here experienced over 200 years ago? And we like to say that this reconstruction is exact. We have a great deal of information on what the original fort was like, and it's reconstructed to its larger size in the spring and summer of 1813. It was reduced in size later in the war for the year 1814 and beyond. But, several officers drew maps of the fort while they were here. Some of them went so far as to pace off and measure the distances between the gates and the batteries and the blockhouses and things like that. And you combine all of that literature, including notes from the engineer who designed and oversaw the construction of Fort Meigs. You combine all that literature with the archaeology that we've performed here, and it not difficult to find where large buildings were and the walls and things like that, and many of our earthworks are original as well. We have a beautiful property here, about 70 or 80 acres even of green space in Northwest Ohio, and you can see the fort there in high summer looking good. But Fort Meigs is enormous. It is 10 acres are enclosed by its stockade wall, and that stockade does run a good mile all the way around. And 7 blockhouses here and 5 artillery batteries that the U.S. Army built. So it's a fairly impressive site, and we hope that all of you can at some point come visit us and learn a little bit more about the story that transpired here, as it is a beautiful property, well preserved, and we are so thankful and lucky to have it set aside, as a lot of sites get consumed by history. So here we go. I've got a lot to cover today, and I'm just going to be going really fast. So if I blow through stuff, please feel free to ask questions. I'm sure we can get answers to whatever you need. But this is the map that I'd like to use for today. And it comes to us from slightly after the war. This is Henry Tanner's map from 1819. But the reason that I really like to use this map is because the Maumee River Valley is so prominently featured on it. That's that dark diagonal crack you see kind of in the center top of your screen. That will be the theater of operations here for 1813. And geographically, the most prominent feature of this area at the time was the Great Black Swamp. And the cartographer here was rather conservative in his portrayal of the Great Black Swamp. It's that sort of darkly shaded area to the southeast of the river valley there. But during the war, certainly, the swamp could be much bigger. Some accounts have it going out as far as the Indiana border there to the west and many, many miles south. And we do have accounts, that make claim that you could travel anywhere in Northwest Ohio by canoe, especially in the spring of the year when the snow has melted and the rains are coming down. So this is an extremely wet, boggy area, and it's going to play havoc for both armies as they're contesting the valley here. So that is the Great Black Swamp, and we'll be dealing with it throughout our talk today. But there's a very crucial spot on the river, and that is the foot of the rapids, and I've marked it there. This will be a choke point for travel in the early 19th century and all the centuries prior. This is the crossing spot on the Maumee River, which is quite wide and deep. And above this on the river, which is to the southwest, is rapids, very swift moving water, very dangerous. And beyond it to the northeast, very deep, very wide. But at the foot of the rapids is where the crossing spot is, where civilization will be in the early 19th century, Western civilization, American civilization. And this will be the contested area where Fort Meigs is. Fort Meigs will be the focal point, not only for the American Army, as it is the headquarters in that second year of the war, but it will be the target for the British and the Allied Army in that second year of the contest. I will not be going through the first stages of the war and the Detroit campaign. Needless to say, both armies are going to have strategies in place in case war is declared. The British strategy, largely the brainchild of General Isaac Brock, is going to be a much more complex plan, and it's executed very well. And you can see the differences in the two maps there. The great sort of red curtain descending out of Canada down through the Great Lakes, and the forts that are taken in the early stages of the war, the early months and weeks. Fort Detroit, most significantly, and the Michigan Territory, certainly. So that's the sort of the prelude to the activities here. And once Detroit has fallen, the Allied presence in Ohio is almost immediate. Within a week, Captain Peter Chambers of the 41st is down here on the ground at the foot of the rapids, and he will be reconnoitering the ground, giving some harassment to some of the local citizenry. And really what he's doing, Chambers is chasing American Captain Henry Brush, who had been leading a supply column northward. He was at the River Raisin community in Frenchtown, about 30 miles north of here. And he was to be included in the surrender of Detroit. And he refused to acknowledge that aspect of the treaty, and grabbed up his supplies and started running south. And Chambers is actually chasing him, and he will miss him by just one day here at the foot of the rapids. But Chambers does grab up a great deal of the stores that Henry Brush was carrying. And this is going to set out an alarm among the citizenry in this area, both on the Maumee River and the Sandusky River. You see there further to the east off of Sandusky Bay there. And the inhabitants of this region are going to begin fleeing in terror. They know the war is going to be coming to this area, and they will become refugees, fleeing to the east in large part, heading for the city of Cleveland, which is a small town at this time, but the population is going to bloom and blossom as more and more people are seeking refuge there under the protection of the 4th Brigade of Ohio Militia. So Chambers' first incursion is what's going to begin this evacuation of the area. And about a week later, the final days of the month of August 1812, General Proctor, Henry Proctor, the overall British commander out here in the West, is going to be touring the area as well. He is wise in thinking that the contest will move to this area next, and he wants to see the ground for himself. So he will ascend the Maumee River by ship as far as navigation allows to this area, the foot of the rapids, but then also the Sandusky River you see there as far as navigation allows. And all the while, he has sent the Canadian Provincial Marine to sail through the western basin of Lake Erie. Ships like the Big Queen Charlotte will be facing her broadside to the American coast, and this is going to increase the sense of alarm among the citizenry here. And really, they are sailing between Cleveland and Sandusky, but you can see them working through the Western Isles as well. And while Proctor is on his mission here to see the ground, is when he discovers that not only Fort Dearborn, which is where modern day Chicago is, Fort Dearborn has fallen. The Americans have evacuated that post, but also Fort Wayne has come under siege by allies to the British, the American Indian tribes working in the region. Fort Wayne is at the very bottom left of the screen there, has come under siege. And this is going to prompt the British to their next adventure, which will be the Muir expedition. And this is led by Major Muir of the 41st, and this is a deep stab into enemy territory and in force. You can see some of the numbers there on the screen in terms of the troops he's bringing. It's hard to exactly pinpoint the numbers involved with the American Indians. Some accounts don't even mention them. Others put the numbers as high as 800, but certainly some high-powered leadership, not only among the American Indians, but also the British Indian Department will be along the way. And they're bringing artillery. So they will ascend the river in the ship Salina, which is actually a captured American vessel, as far as the rapids here, and then proceed overland deep into U.S. territory, dragging their artillery. And this is an adventure that produces casualties. The advanced elements of Muir's expedition are going to collide with some Americans that are moving downriver, the spy corps of the American Army, and there will be casualties. Prisoners will be taken, scalps will be taken. So these are some of the first pieces of bloodshed in the campaign. From his captured Americans, Muir is actually fed some false information, and he's led to believe that the American force that's marching to oppose him is quite huge and outnumbers him by a great degree. The force that was there was larger than Muir's expedition, but not nearly to the amount that he was led to believe. And he's going to have to return to Fort Malden there in the face of oncoming Americans. And he gets back into Canada in the early days of October. But several weeks on the ground for this expedition and a deep stab down the Maumee Valley. What are the Americans doing at this time? I'm trying to breeze right through this because there's a lot we could talk about. But essentially, William Henry Harrison has been named the overall American commander, and his job is going to be to stop the bleeding out here in terms of territory loss in the Great Lakes. So defend the citizens, defend the frontier, and ultimately march on Canada, retake Fort Detroit, retake the Michigan territory, and move into Canada to hold it. And he's going to do that by having three separate forces combine here at this crucial crossing spot, the foot of the rapids. The first expedition is going to move, as we've said, down the Maumee Valley from Fort Wayne and arrive here. A central thrust will come up from the heartland of Ohio. This is Edward Tupper leading mostly Ohio militia. And then an eastern strike. This is going to be made up of militia from Pennsylvania, volunteers from Pennsylvania, and volunteers and militia from the state of Virginia as well. And they will proceed first to Worcester, Ohio, where they will combine with the American regulars and then cross through the Great Black Swamp to this area. And this combined force of militia and regulars is going to be bringing the American artillery along with them. And it's really Harrison's plan, if he can unite this group by the middle of January 1813, he is going to move on Detroit and Fort Malden, the British headquarters, simultaneously that last week of January, the first week of February 1813. Unfortunately for Harrison, the first element that arrived here at the foot of the rapids, General James Winchester's contingent from Fort Wayne, they are going to go out on their own and be defeated at the Battle of the River Raisin, about 30 miles north of here. And Winchester is going to is going to absorb about 1,000 casualties there in terms of dead and captured. And so Harrison has really lost the offensive punching power he's going to need for an offensive strike into Canada. So Harrison really has no choice but to kind of hunker down and take up a defensive stand here at the foot of the rapids. It is an advanced position, and he is in force. And we're not too far away. This is about 50 miles by land from Detroit. It's about 40 miles to Fort Malden from this position over water. So it's a close concentration of American troops. And Harrison's going to hunker down here. And you can see sort of the founding document of Fort Meigs there on the left, Harrison's letter to the American War Department. And the image on the right, this is obviously a modern photograph, but I really like this picture of the fort because it gives you a sense of the commanding sort of castle keep orientation that the fort has. It is up on a high bluff above the river, and the palisade wall is just going to dot the very top of that hill. So it is a good position, defensible ground. It's interesting that the War Department very much disagreed with General Harrison as to what his army should be doing. They wanted him to move back east to Cleveland and fortify there, not only to better protect the American Navy shipyards being constructed in Erie, Pennsylvania, but also to defend the citizenry there in Cleveland. And this Cleveland is where the Jessup boats are being built. The War Department really thinks that the invasion of Canada is going to start from Cleveland, that this will be an amphibious assault across the lake. But Harrison kind of refuses. He thinks he's in a good position, a strong position, and he's here already. He might as well stay. Ultimately, he's looking for about 10,000 men and enough supplies to last them on an aggressive movement north. He's never going to get those numbers. But everything that the Americans are doing is going to result in a very rare over the winter campaign. You know, typically at this time, you would move into winter quarters once November and December hit. But there's a sense of urgency with what Harrison has to do. And you know, when he takes command in mid-September, there's still time left in the campaign season and they want to move forward. They get delayed by heavy rains that are going to start in October. And then they have to wait for a general freeze in order to move. And so the campaign of 1812 never really ends, and it just sort of becomes the campaign of 1813 in a very rare over the winter action. Now, I said that weather would play an important part in our talk. So before we get into the tactical explanation of the battles that are going down here, I did want to focus a little bit on weather. And we know from history that the winter of 1811 into 1812 is quite a severe one. Very, very low temperatures, very dangerously low temperatures in Canada, the Michigan Territory, and northern Ohio here. And this severe winter has an early onset. We have a frost that occurs in September, and this is going to kill off a lot of the crops before they can be harvested. So you have less material going into the granaries for winter. Well, these are hardy, northern farmers, and it should take more than one winter to kill them off. But this early frost is going to result in a very long winter, and the snows don't disappear until June of 1812. And so you have a shortened growing season, the summer of 1812. So you have less crops in the ground. You have less crops that you can store for the winter. And that means two severe winters now in a row, which is going to put even more pressure on the growing season for 1813. And this is going to be a major concern, particularly for the Canadian militia, who are going to come down here with the British and the American Indians to fight. And they're going to be obviously preoccupied with the health of their farms and their families back home. Not to mention, there isn't a lot of meat around either. The livestock is going to be consumed during the Detroit campaign of 1812. So the sheep and the cattle have disappeared because we have two armies feeding on both sides of the river. And so just not a lot of health in the farms of the region. And that's going to play a major role in it. And this winter, this over the winter campaign of General Harrison's to retake Michigan, this is going to be a roller coaster winter in terms of temperature, with very, very cold temperatures followed by extreme warm-ups. And that freeze-thaw cycle is going to play havoc with the armies. Because if you have a frozen swale or pond, a frozen river, and then the temperature warms up, but that ice doesn't fully melt and you have rain down on top of it, you might have 5 or 8 inches of standing water on top of ice. And if you have to move wagons or troops through there, miserable conditions to be with wet feet and then breaking through the ice into the muck beneath. Horrendous to try and keep morale and zeal for the war effort, intact as you're moving along. Or if you have, rains coming down and you have all this soft mud that the army is moving through, big ruts are created, and then it freezes and you have these hard obstacles that will stop the artillery from moving. So just a horrendous winter to try and be moving an army with this kind of roller coaster cycle, especially in ground that's already swampy and wet, as we know Northwest Ohio was. And we have some new numbers here in terms of weather and precision. Or
Oh, there you are. You're back. I was just going to ask Chris if you're frozen on his screen too. So,
okay. I disappeared.
yeah, as you try to get your slides back up, the last thing we heard before you froze was something along the lines of, and we have some new information.
Oh, okay. So not terribly behind schedule, or terribly behind what I was saying. I apologize for that, everybody. Let me bring up my screen one more time and see if this works. We do always have a little hiccup in our internet connection here about this time, about 2:30. So
there you go. Looks good.
If you can see that, we're all good. Yeah, some new information that we've compiled basically from all of the American journals for this time here at Fort Meigs. This is the first 181 days of 1813, the first 6 months or so. And you can see 94, the bottom quote there, 94 of the 181 days has some kind of poor weather, bad enough to the point where soldiers are going to be complaining about it in their diaries. And so you can see how much precipitation is coming down. 35 days of rain, and this is from sun up to sundown. And then, additional precipitation there, 25 days or so of various storms. So a lot of wet weather, and that is going to continue into the fighting season of the spring and summer of 1813. So difficult times to be active. And we have two famous quotes around here from some of the soldiers that are serving. And both of these come from the artillery. Captain Daniel Cushing, as he's moving through the Great Black Swamp, and then also his first lieutenant about a month later, actually in Fort Meigs. But about halfway through Cushing's comment there, you can see, from the time I first entered the swamp until sundown, I did not leave the water, but was from knee deep to waist deep all day, wading in mud, water, and ice, prying out sleds and wagons. You can imagine how horrendous this is in February to be standing in freezing water with your shoes getting stuck in the mud and just trying to move forward. And then his Lieutenant Joseph Larwill, St. Patrick's Day here at Fort Meigs. It is impossible to pass from one tent to another without being over shoe mouth in mud, much less the streets of the encampment where it is half a leg deep. Still to this day, Fort Meigs is a property that does not drain well. And anytime it rains, we're going to have standing water here in the fort for days and weeks after a rain. So what is true today appears certainly to have been true in 1813. Just a very disagreeable place to try to have an army. But it's that strategic location. It's that spot on the river, the foot of the rapids, which is why the army has to be here despite the miserable conditions. Right before I get into the battles, I did put a break for questions in here. It's been about 22 minutes since I've started. I don't know if we want to stop now or should we plow through to some of the tactical level stuff for this two sieges.
I'd say keep going, John. We don't have any questions just yet. And I think I've seen in your slide deck, you have another break just after first siege, right? So
yes, sir. Yes, sir. All right.
Okay. And then a reminder for our audience, as you see something or think of something as we're going along, throw the question into the live chat, and then we'll bring them forward to John either at the next break or at the conclusion of the talk. So.
All right, so this is the famous Seabury map drawn, and this is only a portion of it, drawn by William Seabury, and this is an incredible piece of historical documentation and a beautiful piece of folk art we're going to use just as visual material, I guess, while we're talking. But we're heading into the spring and summer now, and the real big battles, the two sieges of Fort Meigs and the invasion of Ohio. So really the first question is, why did the British come here? Why invade? Well, General Proctor is kind of continuing the policies that were initiated by Isaac Brock at the very beginning of the war. You know, Brock had this idea that the best way to defend Canada was sort of to continuously just push the United States away from the border by limited strikes. And so Proctor is continuing this. He's got a very large force of Americans not very far away. They do pose a threat to him there. So why not knock them out before they can gain strength and take action? And the other reason that he's down here is this is just this is a good faith gesture to your allies, the American Indians. This is a really rare and good example of policy on the ground in the military high command. That policy being sent back with recommendations to the British Parliament in London, and having that policy be adopted as a official British policy. And that is that the British are striving to create an American Indian homeland in the Great Lakes, a buffer, a rubbery area between Canada and the United States of America. And so they have promised, particularly the Shawnee, that Ohio will once again be their homeland. And so by stabbing into Ohio, by making the effort to remove the Americans from it, this is a tremendously good faith gesture to your allies. And so the British will embark on ship. They will sail down from Malden and up the Maumee River. The American Indians will take the land route down from Detroit, and they will surround Fort Meigs and lay it under siege. And you can see some of the numbers there on the screen in terms of the breakdown of the troops. Over 1,000 American Indians led by Tecumseh and Roundhead, and British regulars, artillerymen, the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, and a big contingent of Canadian militia will be down here. They'll offload their guns and drag the heavy artillery from their headquarters about 2 miles away to a position exactly opposite Fort Meigs. And just talking about the weather again, I think it's Richardson who makes note of the fact that, you know, it was such an ordeal to get the British artillery here, especially their big 24-pound guns, that the axles of these cannon carriages, the mud was up to the axles on these guns, and you have teams of oxen and hundreds of men trying to lug these, and the weather just playing such a severe factor in moving equipment because the ground is so soft and it's so muddy. The British will have 2 gunboats that they bring as well to shell the fort, and it's something I'd like to address a little bit in detail on the next part of the show. That bombardment does begin from the gunboats on the night of April 30th into May 1st, 1813. And on the left of your screen is the Richardson map. Richardson is really the only one who paints where those gunboats were. They're the dark, kind of the darkest black blobs that you see in the river, and the Fort Meigs is the little outline there. So we know that the bombardment began from these gunboats, and we know that that fire was ineffective. The Americans will comment that the shells fell short into the hill just to the north of the fort. And then after that, you really don't hear about the gunboats at all. So you have to assume that after falling short, the gunboats were really ineffective and somewhat removed from the action thereafter. And it's just curious, looking at the position that Richardson puts them on, why were those gunboats so ineffective? We recently took some ranges there, and that position, I know where it is. It's right off what is now Orleans Park here in Perrysburg, and it's about 1,000 yards away, 1,030 yards to be fairly exact. And from the water level up to the fort, you have a change in elevation of 46 feet up to the closest point on the fort, and 61 feet up actually to the center of the fort. So not only do you have a tremendous distance, over 1,000 yards, but the increase in elevation is going to make Fort Meigs a really hard target for those gunboats, if that indeed was their position. And it's curious, why weren't the gunboats brought in closer then to really do some damage? Well, again, weather is going to play a factor in here. We've had so much precipitation and rain that the rivers are going to be swollen. The Maumee River is going to be moving very, very swiftly and at bottlenecks at this point. So there's going to be a lot of pressure. And the Americans did comment on how swift and dangerous the river was. So it was likely very, very difficult to get those boats in front of the fort and anchored in a successful position where they could be stable firing platforms. So where Richardson paints them is kind of around this bend where they could seek some shelter from the current, but ineffective fire, we know that. You can see the firing on the list there to the right, the number of shots that were coming into the fort. And these numbers were recorded by Captain Daniel Cushing of the American Artillery. And of course, these numbers are to be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt. I don't know how you get, numbers in the plus 100s and you're keeping an accurate count. I don't know. But certainly the British activity is increasing. And I've marked on the map there at the bottom what their targets were. These are the two powder magazines inside Fort Meigs. There's an eastern and a western magazine, and they will be firing to try and detonate the American supply of gunpowder. And there's a lot of accounts talking about the success of the British guns. Their positions on the opposite side of the river are slightly higher. And so it's about 8 feet higher there, but shoot down inside the fort. And they are ripping the roofs off of these powder magazines. And the Americans inside the fort are mostly busy trying to repair those roofs and keep that powder safe from detonating. The roofs being made of mud and hide and things like that. And this is where Americans are going to take a lot of their casualties from, are the crews that are standing by waiting to make repairs with the next shot coming in. And these big 24-pound balls just, tearing the structures apart. So the Americans will put in escarpments inside the fort, huge earthen traverses that run the length of the fort. And you can see them here in yellow. These are going to be 15 feet high, slightly higher than the walls of the fort. So the British can basically only fire right into a dirt mound in an effort to protect them. And that's what the Americans are doing, trying to stay busy. Of course, they're firing back, but piling up earth to save themselves as the siege gets more severe. As you can see, by May 3rd, 550 shots a day coming into the fort to blast this place apart. And Fort Meigs is taking very heavy damage. On that third day of May, there will be new batteries, British artillery batteries, established east of the fort on the American side of the river. And here's where the gunboats come into play again. I'm curious about this. If the gunboats were ineffective in their fire from the river, why not take the guns off of those boats and move them into the woods? We do know from recovering ordnance here inside the fort archaeologically that the British positions east of the fort were firing a 5.5-inch howitzer and a 6-pound field gun. And these are pretty small. So definitely, if they were the the cannon on board the gunboats, they would not have been able to hit the fort from their position on the river. But they were moved quite close here, about 430 yards away, which is very effective range for that smaller caliber. I know Sandy Antall paints that the gunboats had 9-pounders on them. But if you're going to have to move these field pieces over to the south side of the river anyway, you're going to have to transport them by boats. So why not use that extra artillery in your northern batteries, or why not just take the artillery off of the boats themselves and move them in? So this additional battery that's established in the east is quite curious to me. And here is what's left of those eastern batteries, the Indian battery, as it was called, on the left of the screen. And this is one of the magical places we were talking about at the very beginning of our chat before the slideshow started. This is what remains of that eastern battery, very close to the fort, about 430 yards. So whether they took those guns off of the boats or whether they had these in reserve and were planning on bringing guns in closer, it's hard to say. But the boats are a bit of a current fascination for me, and trying to uncover as much as we can about them. On the right of the screen, this is all that remains of the King's batteries. This is up on the high hill to the north on the British side of the river. And you really can't see that all that well, but if you look at the picket fence there, you see these kind of low slopes in the dirt there. And this is very likely where the British had their big 24-pound naval guns as the highest position on the slope of the hill leading down to the river. It's magical that these are still here with us, that they've been preserved, because not every battlefield has this type of placement. And anytime you come down to the fort, we can take you over there and show you. The heaviest fighting for the first siege is going to take place on May 5th, and we're going to have 3 separate land battles around Fort Meigs in an attempt to break the British siege. What's happened is General Harrison inside the fort has received word that there is a relief force of primarily Kentucky militia coming down the river from the left to the right, and he does get messengers through enemy lines to detail a plan of attack. And part of that plan will be to land half of the Kentucky force on the southern side under Colonel Boswell, about 400 men, and they are to engage the American Indians in the western woods, try and clear that forest area, and reinforce Fort Meigs. This is largely a bloodless affair, and it is a success. These men do make it inside the fort and successfully reinforce it and clear the forests. Meanwhile, a sortie is going to venture forth from Fort Meigs and attack these newly established British batteries on the eastern part of the fort. This is led by Colonel John Miller, who's leading mostly American regulars in a small sortie, about 350 men. And it's interesting, that picture of the batteries I showed you in the previous slide, where the Americans would have emerged from the ravine to engage these British gunners is not very far. Once they would have rushed up out of the ravine and onto the field in front of them, you're already inside of musket range. So this would have been a closely contested fight, and it's going to rage back and forth. The Americans will take these batteries and take prisoners on this, but counterattack is formed. And the American Indians that have recently left the Westwoods are going to slam into the flank of the Americans and partially cut them off in their fighting retreat. And so counterattack is going to be met with counterattack, and back and forth it rages across the battlefields here in the East, and very heavy casualties in a close fight. What happens on the north side of the river is what we now call Dudley's defeat, after Colonel William Dudley, who's leading those men. And this is the Lossing map from the mid-19th century. And Lossing does give a good idea of where the different units were on the battlefield. And that's probably how they ended up. What they were trying to do, you can see the British batteries there are the sort of the half moon shapes right on the riverbank. What they were trying to do is box them in and just swallow them up by surrounding them on all sides and having the spy corps in relief behind them. This is a difficult maneuver to do in terms of battalion level maneuvers. And we know that these Kentucky militia troops were really green. They actually only had about 2 days of battalion level drill in Piqua, Ohio, when they were on their way up here. And this is a very complicated maneuver to do under fire. So they never really achieved this position. They're going to be engaged in battle before they can do this. Their emergence out of the forest will alarm the British gunners, and they will retreat to Fort Miami, downriver, where the British are headquartered. And they are successful, but unfortunately, they're going to be consumed from the forests behind them and fall into a firefight that they continually feed troops into, and it just becomes a disaster. Again, the ground is very soft here. It's been raining for days. It's pouring raining during this battle. So the powder is not working. You can't really maneuver troops in terms of linear tactics when you're standing in mud. So the British are going to come in 2 columns and retake the batteries really without firing a shot, and then simply wait for the Americans to retreat into them from the Indians in the forests behind them. So kind of a dark day. If you're interested in the small details of the tactics over here, Fort Meigs just put out a wonderful podcast episode about the minute-to-minute nature of what was going on over here. But of the 800 men involved here, only about 150 are going to retreat to the safety of the fort, which was what their orders. Many more will die in the forests, and about 600, 650 maybe taken prisoner back to Fort Miami, the British headquarters. Following this heavy fighting on May 5th, there will be a general ceasefire and an exchange of prisoners on May the 6th. Really what Harrison is doing, Proctor believes that Harrison is going to give up the fort, but what Harrison is doing is trying to buy time for his army. They're trying to unload the boats that the Kentuckians brought the day before on May 5th. Many of the American Indians have captured those stores that the Kentuckians brought already and have taken them off, but the gunpowder is still there and the Americans desperately need it. And so Harrison is trying to buy time, while behind him, these boats are unloaded and he can parade his troops and musicians and flags in front of the British in a formal ceremony. That same day, though, May the 6th, is when the Canadian militia does submit their letter to General Proctor. And it will be signed by 6 officers of the Kent and Essex militia, basically saying that we absolutely have to go home. It's now the first week of May. It's planting season. We've been on campaign with you for a while. They do list the poor winters of the previous years and the loss of livestock. And they make mention that many of their troops have already gone home beyond orders. And so Proctor's army is beginning to shrink right before his eyes as the militia no longer have the zeal to be on campaign. Their minds are with their hearths and their families back home. And the American Indians begin dispersing as well. They really felt that they had done their job and done it successfully on May 5th by taking all these prisoners in the battles of May 5th. And now that they've seen Americans and British kind of exchanging peace talks, and they have been excluded from these peace talks. And this is a terribly long history of Euro-American armies not including American Indians in their peace arrangements. And this has irritated a lot, and they've walked off the battlefield in disgust. So by May 7th, there's really only 25 of the leaders remaining with Proctor, and their fighting men have all gone home. May 7th, that day, is the dated date of a letter from Prevost to General Proctor, informing him that in Proctor's rear, York has fallen. Obviously, it's doubtful that Proctor is going to receive this letter the same day that it's written, considering the distances involved. But Prevost will send his aide-de-camp, General Bouquerville, ahead of the letter, and it would be interesting to know, exactly what Proctor's reaction was to this. But things are kind of falling apart at the seams for Proctor, with his army disappearing and now American troops on Canadian soil behind him. So by May 9th, the final shots will be fired and the British will re-embark for Fort Malden. And the first great invasion of Ohio ends at that time, May 9th, 1813.
Thanks, John. We find there's a bit of a time lag between what we're seeing live here on the Zoom call and then the channel. So a reminder, if people have questions, get them in the chat. There aren't a whole lot there, but then Chris and I always have questions. So maybe I'll start with one. Read lots of accounts of the period, and the rapids on the Maumee was a notable feature, that constantly referenced. How populated was the area? Like, my understanding was there was not a community there, that there might be several homesteads in and around that area. Could you describe, how much that Maumee River Valley or Miami River Valley was settled?
Yes, certainly. It hasn't been in American hands very long. All of Northwest Ohio is reserved as American Indian land by the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. So this is all off limits. But there will be additional land cessions in the early 19th century. And everything on the north side of the river, where the current city of Maumee is, the British base, Fort Miami, and their artillery positions for this campaign, that will all come into American hands in 1807 by the Treaty of Detroit, which was worked out by William Hull, the military leader. So the Americans have only had a couple of years of legal, legitimate settlement by the time the War of 1812 comes around. But we do know that there were about 30 families in the Maumee River Valley at the time. And like I said, all of them will become refugees when battle comes here. So there were some structures right across the river in what is now Maumee. And in fact, the American artillerists are ranging their guns by using these abandoned buildings as targets because they're anticipating that the British are going to be, in that area when battle does come, when the siege opens. So the Americans have had time to really sight their cannon well. And it's a way that they can preserve their gunpowder by having very accurate fire here, rather than a lot of trial and error with the artillery. So a lightly populated area. The rapids are about 13 miles long and very dangerous when the water is up and running.
All right. And Dudley's defeat, I also seen it called Dudley's Massacre. I think the local sign in Maumee might describe it that way. What were the number of casualties associated with that?
Well, the actual battle deaths are fairly light. Probably between 50 and 60 actual battle deaths on the ground over there. The enormous, the high number comes in prisoners taken. We're looking at about 600 men being taken prisoner. What had happened was the Americans had left the British gun batteries that they had captured, moved into the forests behind the river or off the river, north of the river. And then the British moved in and retook those batteries basically unopposed. The one company that made it back safely to Fort Meigs kind of were left there to defend the guns, and they flee in terror ahead of the British light company. And so the British can just stand around the guns and wait for the Americans to come back from the forest. Whether they've been victorious in there or not, they're going to have to come back to their boats to get to Fort Meigs. And so the British can just embrace them as they come out of the forest. And so it was mostly prisoners that were taken, and they were marched back to the British headquarters. They were placed on prison ships after a night in Fort Miami. They were placed on prison ships and actually taken out into the middle of the lake until further notice.
And then, similar to the River Raisin, there was an issue with the indigenous people attacking American prisoners in the former fort site, and I guess gave soldiers from Kentucky further reason to hate Proctor and the 41st Regiment.
Yep. Yeah. Kentucky will be filled with vengeful people after the River Raisin. Yes. And after Dudley's defeat out here. So no love lost for General Proctor, who was blamed unfairly, really, for the American deaths, defenseless deaths over there. But war is an ugly thing, and it's difficult to blame one group or another for killing. But yeah, by many accounts, the Americans were inside the fort unarmed and were victim for a while, until actually Tecumseh is credited with quieting the riot level that the casualties had taken over there. So
Yeah, and a British private was killed trying to defend the prisoners as well. So that's captured on the marker over at the Fort Meigs right now. All right. Well, I think that appears to be it. Unless, Chris, do you have a question or?
No, thanks. I think we might as well just carry on. Thank you.
all right, very good. The second part of our show here is quite short, so we'll definitely be out of here in the next 12 or 14 minutes. The second siege of Fort Meigs takes place later in the summer, and it is a much smaller affair by comparing it to the first siege. And again, the question of why invade? Well, the reasons for the first siege are all in place. The idea of removing the American threat through Ohio and demonstrating to American Indian allies that this is part of the overall strategy. But in addition to that, Proctor has a few other reasons. One of them being that he's been very heavily enforced by a huge American Indian army from further in the northwest of the Great Lakes. The north side of Lake Superior up in Canada, current states of Minnesota and Wisconsin have all sent fighting men under Robert Dixon of the British Indian Agency, has been very successful in recruiting fighters for the war, and they're going to arrive in the Detroit River in mid-June. And these are very, very colorful tribes, very exotic clothing, very exotic language, and they make quite a stir. But with thousands of new warriors, Proctor has a problem in which he can't let this force sit idle around his headquarters. They're consuming rations. Proctor has, to think about troops up at Fort Mackinac as well as at Malden, and we can't let these troops sit idle. So, what to do about them? Well, Fort Meigs isn't Proctor's favorite idea for a target, but there's a huge sense of urgency coming from Tecumseh and from the Indian Agency that want to keep this alliance healthy. Tecumseh wants another shot. He needs to remove this big American army. And so Proctor somewhat reluctantly agrees to come down here. And you can see he's got less resources that he can allocate to this. But the Indians do not want to advance on their own without British support. This needs to be a legitimate war effort made by both sides in this alliance as a good faith. So both armies have to be part of this invasion force. But you can see the differences in troops, perhaps 4,000 American Indians on this quest with less than 400 British regulars. So definitely Tecumseh is going to be calling the shots here in terms of what's going to be happening because the British are so heavily outnumbered. So the American Indians are going to meet at what is now Swan Creek in downtown Toledo, Ohio, and form up the various tribes and move down to this area again to surround it. And the British don't have the artillery, the necessary heavy artillery that they need to besiege Fort Meigs. So they can only afford to bring smaller field pieces with them. By this time, the Royal Navy has taken over the ships on Lake Erie from the Canadian Provincial Marine, and they've heavily loaded those boats up with guns, and they are harassing the American shipyard further to the east. And so Proctor really doesn't have the big boats to move the big guns for this campaign. So the British will sail into the Maumee Bay on July 20th, 1813, and they will establish headquarters on the north side as they had before. But quickly after a few days, they're going to move all their operations onto the American side, the south side of the river, to establish a new camp over here. And it's interesting to note, General William Henry Harrison, the overall American commander, is not present at Fort Meigs during the second siege. He has moved to Fort Seneca on the Sandusky River, about 45 miles from here, to put up his encampment there. And Green Clay, who arrived on May the 5th, that bloody day of fighting for the first siege, Green Clay will be the overall commander here inside Fort Meigs. After the British have arrived, the next morning, July 21st, the American Guard Patrol right outside the fort is going to be captured. And this are really the only casualties of the second siege. And this is probably only 6 or 10 guys that are part of this detail moving out to one of the picket stations downriver from here. After that, between the 22nd and the 25th, the second siege will largely simply be small arms as groups of American Indians approach the walls and discharging their firearms, but are ultimately chased back to the trees when the American artillery opens up on them. So small arms are going to dominate most of the days of the second siege. The American Indians are climbing up into the tallest trees and trying to fire down with the rifle shots, but their fire is not very effective or galling the Americans enough, to put them in any state of panic in terms of the troops inside. In the rest of Ohio, there is a state of panic that the second siege generates, and the Ohio militia is called out once again by Governor John Meigs, the namesake of Fort Meigs. He'll call out additional 2,000 Ohio militia members, and Harrison at Fort Seneca is rapidly trying to organize the American regulars to have some kind of fighting force available to contest this new invasion. So 3 days of small arms fire. But on July 26 will be the main feature of the second siege in what we call the Sham Battle. And the Sham Battle is really a ruse de guerre. Without heavy siege equipment, the best strategy that Tecumseh can come up with is to try to draw the Americans out of the fort where they can be consumed. They had done it during the first siege successfully with Dudley's defeat, and we're going to try it again. So this is really a ploy, and what the Allied force is going to do is form up outside of sight of the fort in the forests to the south on the road to Harrison's headquarters on the Sandusky River. There's the road there in black. And they're going to stage a mock battle. They are going to be firing their weapons. They're going to be crying out aloud with the war whoops and really making a good show of it. By a lot of British accounts, it was very convincing, and it was hard to tell if this was a real battle or not. The idea being to fool the Americans into thinking that this relief force from Harrison had been ambushed on the road and they were fighting for their lives out here, and that the defenders of Fort Meigs should come out and save them. So the battle is happening there out of sight. And then once this American sortie had ventured forth to try and render aid, there would be troops waiting to not only consume this sortie and ambush them, but then rush the gates of the fort as the troops were escaping. And once the numbers inside Fort Meigs had been diminished by this withdrawal, then the British infantry could directly assault the walls and have a better numeric ratio in terms of fighting men inside and out. Green Clay has a council of officers inside the fort to try and decide what should be done. And it's interesting to note all of the officers vote to march out of the fort and rescue these troops that are being besieged in the woods. That's how convincing the Sham Battle was. General Clay is the lone holdout, and he stands his convictions, and despite being completely outvoted by all of his officers, decides to keep the gates locked, to keep the men inside and wait it out. He's received some intelligence from Harrison that troops are still a few days away. I mean, you don't know 100% how accurate that information is, or maybe they were able to make a fast force march and they're on the ground. But Clay sticks to his guns and keeps the troops inside. And this is an interesting exercise that we do with modern military commanders when we have workshops out here at Fort Meigs for serving military personnel. This is one of the problems that we present to them and ask them to kind of sort through what you would do about the Sham Battle. Weather will again play a factor, and there is a tremendous thunderstorm that moves into the area, tremendous wind, hail, rainpour. And some may even call this a tornado, and it is going to completely wipe out the Sham Battle. There's no way to continue firing. There's no way to keep up the charade. The guns get silenced, and the Americans are still safely inside. The Sham Battle fails, and 2 days later, on July 28th, the British will formally withdraw. But they have to keep going. They haven't achieved any of their goals. We still have this huge army. We need to keep them occupied. Proctor decides that perhaps he will target some of the smaller installations on the Sandusky River. If he can knock these down like dominoes, there is a huge American supply depot in the far south of the Sandusky River at Upper Sandusky. This will go a long way in feeding these new Indian warriors that have come and having his supplies well stocked for the late summer and winter that's going to be coming. So the American Indians will advance across the swamp, and they get to Fort Stephenson, their next target, very, very quickly. So fast that George Cron, the brevet major that is in command of Fort Stephenson, the post at Lower Sandusky, doesn't have time to evacuate his men, even though he's under orders to do so. They're already around the fort before he knows what's happening. So Major Cron is going to decide to stay and fight. It's really the only thing he can do. The British will sail up the river, and they'll disembark on July 31st. And in terms of size differences, you couldn't have a greater size difference between Fort Meigs and Fort Stephenson, also known as the post at Lower Sandusky. It's about 1/10 the size of Fort Meigs in modern Fremont, Ohio, and only garrisoned with 150 or so regulars from various regiments. It is a well-built fort, though. It was rebuilt under the eyes of the same engineer who oversaw the construction of Fort Meigs, Eliezer Wood. So it will be a bit of a difficult nut to crack. The British will set up artillery on the north side of the river there, or on the north side of the fort beside the river. And it's interesting, the ground around Fort Stephenson is very sort of hilly, and there's a lot of dips and ravines. And so the accounts from this battle say that the British were able to load their artillery pieces down in the ravine out of sight, and then roll the guns up to the tops of these hills, discharge the round, and then have it safely retreat back into the ravine where they could reload the weapons without ever having fear of any American fire. There is only a single piece of artillery ordnance inside of Fort Stephenson, so they don't have much to worry about. They will bombard the fort for a good day, but the Indian agents are letting Proctor know that the alliance is under strain. Of the thousands of American Indians that came to Fort Meigs, only now hundreds have made it to Fort Stephenson. They're losing faith in what's going on. Tecumseh himself believes a better place to go is outside of Detroit and trying to defend their homes against American reprisals in the aftermath of the Second Siege of Fort Meigs. So he will not be present, and many of the warriors go with him. And you don't really hear much about the American Indian involvement in the battle at Fort Stephenson. You have to believe that their centralized leadership has disappeared, and they don't really know how they can help in any degree besides just the threat of their presence in the forests. But from pressure from the Indian agency, Proctor decides that he has to assault this fort. We need to speed up the progress on this invasion. Proctor has been reinforced by troops from Long Point, so his numbers are up a little bit. And if you look at the numbers inside Stephenson compared with the British Army, now probably about 550, 575 regulars. Numerically, you have the advantage, and to assault the walls is not a ridiculous idea. Soften it up with artillery and then do make the assault. If you can assault the fort from two different directions and divide the American defenders inside, force them to defend the north and the south wall simultaneously. That's Proctor's plan. However, it doesn't exactly work out as he wishes. The artillery is unable to open holes in the stockade on the north side where they had concentrated their fire. And when the advanced elements get there, they are not finding any breaches. They do have axemen with them, but it is slow work to chop through a stockade wall. And so they are going to be under fire, withering fire from the Americans. And their counterparts on the southern side, the Grenadier Company, is late getting into position. So this attack is not coordinated well in terms of timing, and all the Americans can concentrate on the north wall. And so the British get into a sticky situation where they cannot advance against the wall and they cannot retreat either. And they just get pinned down outside of Stephenson, and they have to await darkness for some kind of safe withdrawal. The American Indians were also supposed to assault the south wall, and they really withdraw from the field at this time. The relationship between the British and the Indians has soured to the degree that they're simply not willing to participate anymore. They don't think that Proctor's heart is in this, that they don't have the drive, the zeal left to continue. So they will largely withdraw, and the British are on their own. The tribes abandon the field. 96 casualties will be taken at Stephenson. The wounded will be left behind. General William Henry Harrison is advancing on Proctor. He's coming up the eastern side of the Sandusky River, and the British are on the west side, and they barely make their escape by the shipping. And they will have to leave their wounded behind. They will send doctors a few days later to look after their wounded that are sent there. It's interesting to note, though, that the Americans are aware of the strain on the alliance, and they're aware of it to the point where Harrison does send peace envoys to the Detroit area to meet with the leaders of tribes there, asking them to withdraw from the war. And this is before, the Thames campaign. This is before things really are looking in the American favor. But it's so palpable, the vitriol between the Indians and the British, that the Americans are willing to take a chance at getting them out of the war and signing peace agreements at this time. So a peace envoy will be sent right after Fort Stephenson. And by August 18th, this huge force from the Northwest will leave the Detroit River. They'll stop in Mackinac for a month or so before they return to their homes for winter. But that's going to really close down the fighting in Ohio. And this second and last attempt at the British taking Northern Ohio is going to end. The British have to focus now on their own supply issues. While the British were at Fort Stephenson, the American Navy has moved out of Erie, Pennsylvania, and they are now patrolling Western Lake Erie. And the British have a big concern about how they're going to be fed if the American Navy is threatening their supply boats. So that is the story of the British invasions of Ohio. Thank you guys very much. And if you're interested in seeing Fort Meigs or learning more, I invite you all to come down to our first siege commemoration at the end of May. You see the dates there. So thank you guys very, very much.
Thanks, John. That's terrific. We're going to turn to questions now. As Tom said in your first break, there is a delay between what we see on Zoom and what our audience is seeing on YouTube. So sometimes it takes a few minutes for those questions to pop up.
Sure.
But I'm wondering if I can sort of Monday morning quarterback for a minute and ask you if there's anything that you think that the British could have done differently to be successful, especially in the first siege. What could they have done differently?
Oh, golly, that's a really hard question, actually. And I, to be honest, I've never even thought about that before. Fort Meigs is a really a hard nut to crack because of its position. The ground is very well chosen. And when you look at the small details of the fort, it is very well designed for defense, even though this is a frontier nowheresville in Northern Ohio. Very small details will be looked to the defense, and specifically, they designed the fort to withstand artillery. I think they know the command staff here is not at all concerned that the British will directly assault Fort Meigs with an infantry assault. So they don't even look to that. It's all about how to defend against artillery. But I think, if the British had had really tightened the grip around it. So these Kentuckians could never have made it to the fort on May the 5th. Harrison himself is actually really worried about his troop numbers before the siege opens and then during the first 4 days of the siege. He is extremely concerned with the fact that he doesn't have enough men and he needs reinforcements and he's not getting them. And this is apparent in all his writings throughout April. If they had moved further downriver and perhaps cut off any supply, any reinforcement, from further upriver, Fort Defiance and Fort Wayne, and stop the Kentuckians from arriving, they would have definitely had a better shot at getting Harrison to surrender. But he certainly could have held out for a long time in a traditional siege where you're, camped out for weeks or months outside of the fort. It would have been a long campaign anyway.
Yeah, I think that that's a fair point. That we looked at a lot of the sieges, informal sieges in the War of 1812, and there just wasn't the time to sort of settle in for a formal siege. So, maybe it's a fair statement to say that it wasn't really winnable for the British at that point.
Well, it's also interesting, how long would have Proctor stayed here if his Canadian militia hadn't asked to depart, and if his American Indian allies had thought that there were more trophies to be had, that it was in their interest to remain. I mean, Proctor, I think he's forced to withdraw, even though he doesn't want to, because his army is kind of melting away.
I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that Tom might have more questions. So I'm going to turn it over to him for just a second.
Actually, no. So I think we've been at it a while. So there isn't really much more to add here. So.
Well, I hope for all the people that were watching at home that things were clear. If you weren't familiar with the sieges here, I was going really fast, and of course, I know the story well. It's always difficult to know who knows what and who doesn't. So, I hope it was of interest to those watching.
Well, I hope so too. It's I think an aspect of the War of 1812 that I know well, but I'm not sure a lot of people know the details around it. So it's good to give it some light and consideration. So well, let's wrap this up here. Thank you, John. We really appreciate this. That was very well done. I think a great talk, some really good information there. Thank you for Chris, to all that he does. For our audience, I hope you join us again in April. I think it's a really fascinating topic, looking at Napoleon's foray into Russia and what was the Russian strategy to meet that. And we hopefully in April have some new wrinkles to introduce. We have some other ideas or plans on how we can further get content onto our channel. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your